I feel as though this is a formal interview, but it's not. This is just a conversation that we happen to be recording. Today is July the 25th, 26th, 2008, and we were just asking, the 24th.
No, it's not.
It's 26th. We were just asking if possibly you wouldn't mind telling us the story of the silverware set that is inscribed with the letter W.
Well, my mother had a cousin, and her name was Eleanor Waldschmidt. Her maiden name was Keller, and she married the first time anybody in the family had ever married a Catholic person.
Oh.
And of course, when I heard stories about Catholics, I thought, well, I didn't know it. It was an entirely foreign subject to me. Anyway, it was before I worked for the Catholic school and so on. I became used to the Catholic ways. There were church masses and all that stuff. But this Eleanor, she was a great socialite, but I don't think they planned to have children, because at that time Catholics had a promise that they would raise their children in the Catholic faith. And Joe didn't want Eleanor to promise that.
Have to feel obligated to do
Yeah.
that.
So they never had children, and of course he was a printer, and they lived in Harrisburg. And Eleanor was she liked company and social life, but they never, when they came, it was an occasion. And every time they drove in, then my grandmother would say, oh, here comes Eleanor and her Catholic. So you never forgot that Catholic side of the story, you know.
Even though Lutherans are supposed to be Catholics once removed.
That's
Have
right.
you heard that expression before?
Anyway, we always used to say that it was a byword in the kitchen that for a Catholic he was pretty nice.
Oh.
Yes, surprisingly so, you know.
And his name again was?
Waldschmidt.
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 And his first name?
Joe.
Joe.
And that's how come the W on the silverware. Yeah.
And it's through, did they
Kellers.
buy it? Or who bought it for them?
No, I don't know. I don't know.
So was it passed down along Joe's family?
Probably.
Or did they get it, did Joe get it new with Eleanor?
No. Then when they had sale, then I bought the set at their sale for just a couple pennies. People weren't buying things. The sale wasn't advertised well, and they had some lovely carpets and rugs. And
So Joe and Eleanor had a sale? Because
well, they were dead. They found her.
Oh.
We don't know whether somebody killed her and robbed her, but we know she was robbed because her jewelry was all gone. And she was found at the foot of her stairs, dead. And they don't know whether she fell down.
Oh dear.
She had
Whether she was pushed
injuries,
down.
you know, but they didn't know whether it was from the fall down the stairs or whether somebody had hit her. Well, anyway, we didn't know she was dead and gone, and we didn't get Christmas cards for a couple of years. And then my aunt said, well, now they're going up to Harrisburg and they're going to look them up. Well, I said, you better call and see,
Sure.
you know, rather than make the trip. So they called, and somebody answered. And then she said, well, she was calling for Joe Waldschmidt. And then he said, are you a relative? And she said, yes, by marriage. And he said, oh, they're so happy to locate somebody because nobody could settle up their estate. They had...
Because there was no
they had no
local
will.
family. Through
No.
Joe either?
No, no.
And no children, obviously.
And so they sold like that silverware and wonderful things were sold because they had to settle up this estate.
Did the silverware come in the case?
Yeah,
That beautiful case?
yeah.
And so Eleanor was your cousin,
Now my mom's cousin.
your mom's cousin.
My grandfather's name was Ezra Keller, and her father's name was Henry Keller. And Henry and Susan was a wife. They only had they had two children, Norman and Eleanor. And I often wondered where Norman's children are because they would be the closest relatives on the Keller side that I would have left.
And the Kellers all lived in Lancaster County? Where did the Kellers live?
Well, they
Largely.
lived in Clay Township, around between Clay and Lincoln, along 322. They farmed 108 acres there, but they didn't own the farm. They were just tenant farmers. And that's where I grew up because my mother died when I was 8. And then we kids were sorted out to the relatives. And my brother and I were raised by the Kellers. And Catherine, my sister, was raised by the Eberlys. And Elsie Aldhouse adopted Helen, and that she was like a mother to her. And Helen was only 6 days old when my mother died. My mother died with complications of childbirth.
With Helen.
Hmm?
With Helen.
With Helen.
Yeah. And the Kellers took in you and your brother.
Hmm?
The Kellers took in you and your brother.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you were the only 2 siblings living
Well, my
together.
brother was only 18 months old.
Oh.
So there he was like well, he could walk, but he was still in diapers.
Sure.
And since I was older, I could help to take care of
care
him,
of
and that's
him.
why the Kellers. Of course, my grandfather Keller was a very, very lovable man. And of all my relatives, I think I revere him. I can remember things that we discussed, and I can remember, this is a dumb thing to talk about, but one time he was holding me and a fly came and sat on my hand. And then he sang this song, "Baby bye, here's a fly, let us watch him, you and I."
But those are the neat memories.
Isn't that funny how you remember things like that?
Yeah. Well, and obviously Dad was telling us the other day that they were fantastic at encouraging you to get education and to go to school.
Well, see, I was pretty smart, and everybody admired my ability to learn, and I just happened to bump into the right people to help to finance that. Now, my grandfather figured I did enough work around the farm to earn, it cost $3.28 a month for a school ticket to go to high school. And he figured I did enough work on the farm that he would pay that, and he did. And he never asked for any, pay it back.
Mm-hmm.
And anyhow, then when I graduated, I was all ready to go to work on a farm. I figured if I worked a year, then I could earn enough money, then I could go to school. Well, then the man had saved money for his daughter, and she got pregnant and had to get married, and he was so mad that he came and threw $300 on my washer. I was getting ready to hire myself out on a farm. I said, "Here, you go to school."
How did he know you? How did you know him?
Well, he was a friend of mine, and you know Abe Althouses?
I know the last name, the Althouses.
Well,
yeah.
anyway, Mrs. Alt, it was her parents, Abe's wife's
Okay.
parents, that had saved money for her to go to school, and then she had to get married and then wasn't going to use it. And so since they had the money, well then I borrowed $400 to go to school 2 years. And then I paid it all back at 4% interest, which was high in those days, but nowadays that's the rate.
Oh, I'd say that's a going rate.
Yeah. So I consider myself very lucky.
And just because I'm curious, what school was that you went to?
Huh?
What school was that you went to?
Well, I graduated from Ephrata High School,
Okay.
and then I went to Millersville,
All right.
and then I went 2 years. And then later I went back and got my degree, and then I became a librarian, and then I got my master's degree from Drexel in Philadelphia.
That's right. I remember that part of the
Yeah,
story. And
yeah.
what was it like to take a young girl from Lancaster County and go to school at Drexel in Philadelphia?
Well, they appreciated my wit, and they made fun of my accent, but I didn't care.
Anything that you remember about Philadelphia from that time? Things that struck you as, wow, that's really something.
Well, I would go to these lectures, and then I would comment. Sometimes, that how it is, people ask you your opinion of things. Well, my accent and some of the things that I had to tell about were interesting, and this lady came one time after class, and she said she would like to have me to her house for dinner. And it was in not a good part of Philadelphia, kind of a righty place. And on her wall she had these, the feet of some seabird. Well, of course, I never thought of hanging anything like that on a wall, and I must have remarked about it. Oh, and she laughed. She got a big kick out of that, you know. And she stayed friends with me, and she kept introducing me to people. I was a typical Pennsylvania Dutch specimen, you know.
Yes.
uh,
That still happens.
yeah,
You're from Amish country? Are you Amish?
that's right. People
Yeah.
always think you have to be, or
Yeah.
Mennonite, or you're
Yes.
Mennonite. So I met a lot of interesting people, and then I had a black woman for a folk literature course, and she admired my way of telling stories, how I would imitate the characters and everything. So she would come and have me do stories for the other classes that didn't have anybody that could do that, you know. I was kind of spoiled, you know, but it all bunched together into being a good experience.
Were you at all tempted to stay in Philadelphia, or you were bound and determined to get back to Lancaster
Well, I
County?
used to stay for a week at a time. Another girl and I had rented the kind of it was like a little apartment, but it was only 2 rooms. And it was like a sitting room and a bedroom with a little bed. And we'd go out to eat, and sometimes we'd make things, but not very often.
Mm-hmm.
And so we ate at, I remember we went to some place where they had 32 different kinds of dishes. And it was like nowadays you'd have a smorgasbord, but it was just little tastes of things. And we always liked to do that. And, well, then
Tapas is what they also
there was a
call
fellow
it.
who was a librarian in Cocalico, and then he and I would share rides. We would take turns driving to Philadelphia. Well, then one winter we went to night school, and we had this teacher who was gung-ho on extemporaneous speeches.
Oh, well.
And one day in the midst of his lecture, he stopped and he said, "And now we'll have Mrs. Fry give an extemporaneous speech." And I was just dickering at home to ask the PTA to buy a rug for the library so the kids wouldn't have to sit on the cold floor. So I gave this pep talk about how we need a rug for the library, and I need something to warm their bottoms while I warm the cockles of their hearts. And
Aww.
I spread it out there. And it was so quiet when I sat down. I thought, oh my God, you flubbed that up, Bert.
Aw.
And nobody else had ever give a speech. And they all thanked me because he figured if I was so blame good, why I was going to take a chance at asking anybody else.
Aw.
I figured he thought he could make sort of a fool out of me because I was about the oldest person in the class. So I didn't care if he did. I did what he asked me to do, and that was all I could do.
And she is fantastic at telling stories. She would come to Girl Scout functions that I would attend as a Girl Scout and tell stories. Do you remember that?
Hmm?
That my Girl Scout functions, you would be a storyteller at the Girl Scout functions.
That was at the
Furnace Hills.
Furnace Hills, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if you would do us the favor. Would you also tell a story? Something on the order of a folk tale that you would tell at a Girl Scout function or something for the kids?
Well, do you know the story about the Taily pole?
I don't.
Well, there was this old man lived in the mountains, and he had 3 dogs. You know, I know, and come to Cocalico, and they were living under his shack. And one time he heard something sniffling and snuffling around his fireplace. And he had his hatchet beside his bed, and so he took his hatchet and he slung it, and somebody and jumped out the window, broke the glass. And he got up and he lit his lantern and he looked, and here was a hairy tail. And dumb like, he cooked it and he ate it. Well, he went back to bed, and about 2 o'clock at night I hear something scrabbling up his log cabin. I want my taily pole. Give me my taily pole. And he looked, and there was these great big eyes at the fireplace. And he was getting scared, and he didn't move. He was so just paralyzed. And the thing came, and he could feel it climbing up the bottom of his bed like a cat climbing up the covers. And these big eyes were coming, and he said, "Give me my telepo. You have my telepo." Oh, and the guy's heart was beating so fast it was almost jumping. And he tried to call his dogs. Come to Kirk Halligan. And the dogs came and chased the thing away. And he went back to bed. Well, a couple hours later, here it was again, climbing up the side of his house. "I want my telepo. Give me my telepo." And he tried to call his dogs. I know. But what he didn't know was that thing had chased them into the hills and they never came back. So he was just shaking and quaking, and he was afraid. And finally he felt it climbing up the covers, and he saw its big fiery eyes coming toward him, and it was saying, "Give me..." "Take it," he said. And then you have all the kids jump out of their skin.
Yeah. I think I remember that one.
Do you really?
Yes. Dad also said something very flattering towards you. He said that you were very supportive of him
Oh, yes.
going to school too.
I always thought when I was younger, I would read about the Girl Scouts and the campfire girls, you know. And we lived in the country, and we used to build these shacks like with rails and burlap bags. But my grandmother would never let us sleep out there. She always made us come in. She said she wants to know where we are. And so I used to always dream about what it would be like to camp outside and really cook, you know. And at that time you took soft soap and you soaped the outside of the kettles so that if you put them over the campfire, the soap would keep the soot from baking on, and you could wash it. Well, anyway, one time one of the girls put the soap on the inside, and we made vegetable soup. Oh, it was horrible. But I was choking down. I wasn't going to say anything, and then one of the girls said, "Say, this tastes like soap." And then she said, "Well, it goes. I put the soap in the kettle instead of on the outside."
Were you a leader too? Were you a Girl Scout leader?
Oh, yeah, for 20 years.
I did not know that.
We used to go camping, and we went to the Girl Scout camp, and they had wooden platforms. And then the Lions Club had tents, and the Lions would the fathers of the girls would put the tents up, and then we would stay there. And then one time, somebody had to go to, I used to always have, before we went to bed, I'd say, "Now this is the last call to go to the latrine. You have to go to the toilet, you have to go now. And if you have to go later, I won't go with you, because I'm going to go to bed." Well, you know how the kids were, they would horse around. And well, anyway, one time one of them went to the toilet, and she came running back, and she was as white as a sheet. Oh, she said, "There's something hairy in the bathroom." Oh, I said, "Get out." Yeah, I could feel it on my bare feet. She said, "It's hairy." Well, I had to get up, and I went down, and it was a little possum.
Oh.
I was shivering.
Yeah. I didn't know possums are that hairy.
Those were the days.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have any other?
Oh, I could ask questions for a while, but
I used to come home from those camping trips, and I would take a shower and go to bed and just sleep.
yes.
Even as a Girl Scout, that's what I would do.
Do you remember Shirley when she was little? She was a pistol, wasn't she? A real firecracker, Shirley?
Was I? No.
Well, I didn't get to see too much of her.
Well, I remember, we were talking about this the other day, I remember going to your house and always being able to pick out
Harold?
a book, and I remember going to and getting eggs with Harold.
Yeah.
That's my memory with Harold, is whenever we would get there, we would do two things. We would go and get eggs from the chicken house, and we would walk with them,
Did
and
you
he would
ever
bring us there.
fish in the pond?
I think we did do that too. He might have done that more with the boys. But then I remember the other thing we would always get is a book from the piles and piles of books from your collection.
One time, one kid in the neighborhood was lost. Oh, they were turning, they had to call the
Hi.
police and they couldn't
Sorry, I'm
find
sure
him.
there's nobody in
And I
there,
went
but we
upstairs to
can't
get
find
something
him.
and I went into the
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
room where I kept my books, and here he was fast asleep on the studio couch. And he had gone up there to read and then fell asleep.
Who was this?
My neighbor, neighbor boy.
Oh.
And I used to tell him if he wants to go up there and read, he can read it. He doesn't need to ask. He can just go
Yeah.
up there. Because it was a little 2x4 room, and all that was in it was a studio couch and the bookshelves. And he would go up there, and he was sort of a bookworm, you know, and he read until he fell asleep, and then he was sound asleep, and of course forgot where he was. And his mother hadn't known he was up there, and she thought he had roamed around. Sometimes he rode his
You
bicycle.
can enter.
Hi.
Hi.
What's going on?
No,
No,
and
someone
someone
just
else
came to
already
check.
checked.
Okay.
They lost someone.
Dot, I have one more question for you, if
Yes.
you don't mind. You said that your grandfather, you remember your grandfather. Do you know how far back your family goes here in Pennsylvania?
We have the Eberly book.
We'll have to look at that. But I was just wondering, can you remember great-grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers even?
Well, the Kellers came from south of Munich in Germany, and the Eberlys were also from the Black Forest area. And old Grammy Eberly had red hair and smoked a corncob pipe, and she used to babysit my dad and my aunt when my great-grandmother did the barn chores. And my dad used to always tell the stories. And there's one that I can never locate in English, and he called it Dino Fefal. And it was about a woman who, I don't know whether she had an illegitimate child, but anyway, her family disowned her and sent her out into the woods where she bore her baby then, and he was raised like a wild boy, you know. But he wore her ring. And when he was about 7 or 8 years old, he was running around wild in the forest, and her brother went hunting and saw this kid running around, and they caught him. And the brother nearly had a stroke of apoplexy when he saw the ring, because that was their family ring, you know. I used to sit mesmerized by that story. So it's such an exciting thing happening in your own family.
Yeah.
So, but I never had any historical proof of that, you know. It was
So
just
was this story passed down in
word of
Pennsylvania
mouth.
Dutch
word of mouth. Well,
or German?
it all had the Pennsylvania German overtones, but
Okay.
you never knew whether they made it up to fit our family or whether our family really was part of it.
There's another question. Oh, how did you meet Harold?
Well, I graduated from college, then I couldn't get a job. So I had to work in a shirt factory. And I used to see Harold around once in a while, and I thought it was pretty nice looking. And so one Saturday, I went to stay overnight with a girl in Ephrata, and we went to the movies. And after the movies, when we came out, there was a sudden thunderstorm.
Do you remember what you saw?
Huh?
Do you remember what you saw that night?
What film?
No.
Well, anyway, we went into some doorway to get out of the pouring down rain, and two guys came rushing into the same doorway to get out of the rain, and it was Harold and his brother.
Aww.
And then when they found out that we had walked uptown, they offered to walk us home.
As gentlemen
And
do.
that was before Harold had a car, you know. And I was 18, I guess. And, well, then a couple nights later, I was in bed, and I heard somebody say to the girl next door, "Is Dorothy at home?" And she said, "Oh, she's married and lives at Akron." And she had a sister, Dorothy, who was married.
Oh.
And boy, when I heard that, I thought, well, I better get down there and play.
And make sure that
My
they-
property.
Yeah. Oh. And
So-
was it Harold?
I ran down, and then it was Harold. And he wanted me to go. He was very churchy at that time. He wanted me to go to some revival service in his church. And I said I would go. And I went, and I was sitting there listening to the sermon, and the preacher got up and said that he was aware that there were some strange girls in the neighborhood, and that they had designs on the young men and were stealing them away, you know. Mad, I was madder than a wet hen. And the minute he closed his mouth, I got up and I went out. I thought, well, I'm not talking to him, not shaking his hand at the door. And his name was Reverend Wasser. Well, then when he saw how angry I was, I guess he thought, well, he had gone a little bit too far. But that cooked me on that.
Oh.
But then Harold and I courted for 6 years before we got
6 years? Wow.
Well, you gotta test these things. You can't do it overnight. You can't go rushing
Well,
into
we thought we
anything.
didn't have enough money, and that was a dumb thing to do. We should have gotten married.
Yeah.
We could have saved more money had we been married than we did by running around.
Separately. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So anyhow,
I definitely remember Harold.
well then Harold, he liked to play baseball, and so he played softball, and he was on this and that team. Well, I didn't much care about that stuff, and he was a catcher, and he and the pitcher would have this running commentary, you know, and I thought that was poor taste, but that they say that's the way the big team did.
I do have one more question for you, and it's another favor to ask. Do you mind speaking some Pennsylvania Dutch now, just so we could record it? I don't know if I'll hear it again for a while.
Well, what can I say?
Oh, you could say,
You could tell a short story in Pennsylvania Dutch or whatever, and then tell the translation in English.
I'm a little stale on stories. I've just zwommen en poisse hen zo gekliche mush essen. En als ze hen net gekliche dat kesselwäsche. Nou had ik al een dag gezegd, oh, ik ken mijn mush. Ik deed gleich een mush hebben. Wel, hat sie gesagt, ich koche dann einen Kessel voll Musch. Und sie haben den Musch gegessen, es war alles gut. Und dann hat sie gesagt, na, aber ist der Kessel? Wel, hat gesagt, aber ist nicht. Und hat sie gesagt, was ist noch nicht? Well, sie haben erst gemacht, na, als erstes schwätzt, selber muss der Kessel waschen. Ja, sie sind ins Bett und der nächste Mal sind sie wach geworden und sind nicht aufgestanden, sind im Bett geblieben. Und die Nachbarsfrau, sie war so, sie hat andere Leute Businessmänner wollen. Und sie ist gekommen und sie hat ins Fenster reingeguckt, da war sie im Bett gelegen. Und sie ist rein und gesagt, was ist letzt? Für was stehen wir nicht auf? Keine Ahnung. Bell, hat sie gesagt. Sind da krank? Wel, ik denk ik moest even arbeigen. En wel, als ze het niet lenig blijven, dan hat sie er noch was gesagt. Du bleibst da und du watschst sie, weil ich da breche. Alright, hat gesagt. Aber ich tue es nicht für nix. Well, sie hat an die Wand geguckt und da war ein Kot gehangen und hat gesagt, well, du kannst da einen Kot haben. Und die Frau ist aus dem Bett geschoben und sagt, du gibst mal meinen Kot nicht weg. Well, that was the end of that.
well,
So what's the translation?
Well, that they decided that whoever would get out of bed first would have to wash this awful mush kettle.
Oh.
And so they weren't talking, they didn't want to be the one to wash the kettle, you know. And then the neighbor woman came and said, well, she'd give her coat away if somebody would wash them. And then she said, well, you're not giving my coat away.
Do you get to speak it a lot around here?
Oh,
Or
yes.
So there are a lot of people who
This
live
is a
here
Dutch
speak.
area.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of the Mennonite people are really Dutch.
And I saw all the road signs have the Pennsylvania Dutch
Yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah.
Do you enjoy getting to use it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have never been sorry that I'm bilingual.
Was Pennsylvania Dutch your first language, or was English your first
Huh?
language? Was Pennsylvania Dutch your first language, or
No.
was English your first English?
I was bilingual ever since I could remember.
Okay.
I could talk English
Simultaneously.
and I could talk Dutch. And it depended on where you were, which you used.
Mm-hmm.
And both of my sets of grandparents were Dutch, so I talked Dutch to them. And it came naturally. So,
Yeah, so the Dutch came from both sides.
yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
do you have memories of your parents?
Do I have memories
Or of your mom, excuse me.
Well, in a way, I was pretty little. I was only 8 years old when she
You were
died.
8 when she died?
And she was a soprano singer and sang in the choir. And I will never forget, I can hear her voice at Christmas when they had a processional and they sang Silent Night. And I can hear her voice above the rest, you know.
Aw.
That's sad.
Yeah.
But she was only 25 when she died, so she was young.
So she had you when she was 17.
16,
16.
barely 16.
My goodness.
Wow.
Her birthday was the 5th of December and I was born the 23rd, and then she was 16.
Wow.
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 Yeah.
And then your dad lived quite a long time
Oh yes, he was
after that.
89 when he died.
Yes. And I believe I met him a few times too.
Yeah.
So, wow.
It was a rough road to hoe when you grew up, but you wouldn't swap those experiences because it helped to make you the person that you are.
Right. But
I-
you grew
I-
up awful fast then.
Yeah, yeah.
And you were precocious because you were a reader just to begin
Yeah,
with.
right. And I read everything that came down the pike, just everything. And some of the stuff I didn't quite understand. And then one time I had the shock of my life. I opened the paper and my father's initial was William D. Eberly. And here it said William D. Eberly was arrested for sodomy. And I didn't know what sodomy was, but I looked it up and I thought, oh my
Yeah.
God. Well, I was worried about this, and then my grandmother saw that something was troubling me. She said, what's the matter? Well, then the kids on the way home from school were teasing me about
Yeah.
this, and it made me feel terrible. And so I finally told my grandmother that the kids at school are saying my father's no good, and that he was arrested, you know, and so forth. Well, then she investigated, but found out it wasn't my father, but it was this man that had the same middle initial and
Yes.
name that he had.
Yes.
And he was a flake, I guess, you know, or they wouldn't have caught him, things like that. But you can't imagine how that shakes a kid up.
Yes, when you're keeping that inside
Yeah,
too.
and you just, there's nothing you can do about it because it's a fate accomplished.
Did you have a sense of relief after you found out it wasn't your father?
I should say.
Yeah.
And so whenever I saw William D. Eberly, I always, this other William Eberly was quite wealthy. And he had a grocery store in Ephrata. And of course, had his gay friends. And only now do I understand what a large clientele maybe that was. And that his store was only a front maybe for some of his activities, you know. But kids worry about such things needlessly. They don't understand. And
Well, there are 2 sets of Eberlys from 2
oh, there are
different.
more than 2
More
sets of
than
Eberlys.
2? Yeah.
Around Mount Airy, you have 3 or 4
Really?
different kinds of Eberlys. And they're not related. They're not related.
Well, but our family tree goes back to the Eberly brothers that came here, Dad was telling me.
That what?
The Eberly brothers that came and started up on the hill some business that came over from Germany. Is that where our Eberly tree starts? No, where does our Eberly tree start?
Well, our Eberlys came from the Black Forest
Yeah.
area in Germany.
But who was it that first came?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Now, I have an Eberly book, but that's very, do you have an Eberly book?
Yes, yes. But I think it only goes as far as Dad's generation. I don't think it's been updated since then.
No, no.
Yeah. Who
So-
was it? Who's in charge of updating those, or?
I don't know, the guy that wrote the original book is no longer
Yeah.
living.
Yeah.
And whether he willed his rights to it, I don't know.
Hmm.
The copyright, you know.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. But that's pretty far for it to go through my dad's
Yeah,
generation,
yeah.
though. So.
Well, then I always used to be ashamed of the name Eberly because it means wild boar.
I knew that. Yeah. Yeah.
What uncouth background. uh,
And then with the Eberbach, the city in Germany, has some of the same. Isn't that the signia of Eberbach? It has or Eberbach, however you pronounce it.
well, they
has
had
a
an
boar.
exchange, and what was his name? Oh, I can't think of his name. He used to lead those Eberbach trips. He was an Ephrata man, but then he had a heart attack and died, and now those trips were canceled.
Mhm.
He was the leader.
Well, I think they still do some things with.
Well,
Because
some-
Ephrata and Eberbach are
Yeah,
sister cities.
They're sister cities, like.
But isn't the Eberbach, doesn't it have some connection with Eberly, or at least comes from the same root
No,
word
some of
or
the Eberlys
something?
came from that area.
Okay.
So, and of course, some ancestor Eberly ladies had red hair, and there's hardly anybody now has red hair of us. Can you think of any red-haired Eberly?
Mm-mm.
No.
No, maybe highlights of red hair,
Uh,
like Janice and Lamar's Becky. Maybe has some highlights of red hair, but
So-
no. Hmm.
Oh, yes.
My family is German as well. The winter name comes from Württemberg, Germany, and my grandfather paid a genealogist to do some research, and he could go on.
Those Germans were of a good, solid stock,
I have
and
to
they
agree.
had that work ethic. And I don't care which branch of the family, there's always somebody who's get up and go and made something of himself.
Mm-hmm.
We'll let you know if we find one of those in my family, but
No. That's true of your family too.
Oh, yes.
we have some English in us as well, I think.
Yeah.
And as far as you can remember, your stock is all German. Your whole family, and there's no
Or Swiss, German,
Swiss German. Okay.
The Kellers, my mother's side, that was over into Switzerland a little bit, but south of Munich and into that Swiss area.
Well, that's neat. We just found out that as we're going and making our way to Cameroon, we're passing through Switzerland. We'll be in Zurich for a day. So, did you ever make it over to Europe yourself? Did you ever get to visit?
Oh, yes, but I wasn't in a position that I could go out on my own and explore. I went on a children's literature tour once, and once I went as a chaperone to students, and I had some wonderful experiences, but I never really barged out on my own, to have, I was awfully fond of Scandinavia.
Wow.
I love Scandinavia.
Were you able to make it back to Germany, to
Yeah.
the Black Forest area?
Yes, yes.
And
And
are there
did it feel familiar in some strange way?
There were places in south of Munich where I could talk Pennsylvania Dutch to people. And when I found somebody like that, they didn't want to let you go.
Aw.
And one time I had to catch a bus to go back to where I was supposed to be. I had gone on a little shopping trip with some ladies. And this lady followed me. She even took one step up on the bus. Oh, she said, "Man kann's nicht glauben." She could hardly believe that I could talk to her. And yet I wasn't actually German, But she was so pleased.
Now, are there a lot of Eberlys still there?
Huh?
In that area, are there a lot of Eberlys still living there?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so.
But there are still people who speak Pennsylvania Dutch there.
Well, it's not Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's Pennsylvania Dutch is a dialect,
Yeah.
and of course we coined vocabulary to suit
Sure.
our needs,
Absolutely.
Yeah, over here.
and it loses its authenticity then.
I am very grateful that you were able to share some of that with us today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna turn this off.